since the year 2000, 32% of R&D expenditures compared to their GDP. The situation here in Canada is far worse. It's 32% in Quebec only, and in Quebec it's only 25%. In order to respond and to stimulate industrial research and development for development, product development, to develop new solutions and integrate new policies, we have put in place tax measures, direct interventions, as well as indirect interventions. As we've heard about support by colleges and universities, and we've spoken about non-financial support. Regarding tax measures, we were able to look at a number of nations, for example, in Europe. This brings us to a level of tax incentives that's very competitive. So it is not a lever that surprises us. It's around 67% in Canada, 73% in Quebec, compared to 59% in Europe. So it is not a lever that we can use. Companies are also asking us for greater simplicity regarding processes so that they can access incentives in an efficient manner. So the Innovation Council, with respect to these findings, was asked to find solutions. So without additional funding, and it is proposing a series of recommendations that we tabled, Madam Chair, to your committee. So first of all, it's to incite companies to invest more in R&D by redirecting some of the financial incentives to fundamental research, and to rather redeploy this to experimental research and to commercialize innovation. That is a recommendation made by our council. This was followed by the Minister of Finance of the Government of Quebec, who undertook a fundamental restructuring of the last budget regarding our tax approach and R&D. Now we call it the Research and Commercialization Credit, CRIC, in our as a number as well. We have the Council of Innovation, and we work with Quebec companies, and we also try to further develop research and innovation. And it's all about skills. We're trying to strengthen the skills of leaders to develop, to undertake R&D, to manage innovation. All of that is key. So companies that are not digitized, that are not productive, will not be successful in achieving a margin to invest in R&D. They must be incentives in place in order to enable them to undertake a digital transformation. Also, we must prioritize certain sectors. We must prioritize support for some companies. We need to consolidate the different players and organizations who are in the field and who provide support to companies. The idea is to simplify and to strengthen their power and impact in strategic sectors. Again, we need to enhance the ability of the ecosystem to develop venture capital, to develop the new generations, and to achieve a critical mass. It's also important to explore new means of financially supporting innovation other than through grants, for example, loans, as well as different types of subsidies. We need to generate data to understand the situation, and we need to ensure that we will simplify their processes and the administrative burden, reduce that burden, also reduce delays, and to make it easier to access different programs. With that data on hand, we'll be able to measure the situation. We will be able to assess the weaknesses and strengths, and to see whether or not there is progress or not. I will stop here. There are many other ideas available here for you. Our objective is a key strategic objective given the current context. We need innovative companies, and these are more profitable, more resilient firms that are able to export and bring wealth back here to this country. We need this wealth in order to uphold our social model. Thank you.
Bergen, for 5 minutes, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss business R&D investment in Canada with you here today. My name is Benjamin Bergen. I'm here as the president of the Council of Canadian Innovators. We're a national business council representing over 175 of Canada's leading technology companies. All of CCI's members are headquartered here in Canada, with more than 52,000 employees across the country. They are market leaders in sectors as diverse as healthcare, financial services, agriculture, and of course, AI. CCI was founded a decade ago on a simple but powerful idea. Canada's prosperity depends on the success of Canadian headquartered companies. From day one, the Council has championed unapologetically domestic economic strategy, one that treats innovation and ownership as cornerstones of national sovereignty. In the past year, it feels like the national conversation has finally caught up with us. It was good to hear Prime Minister Mark Carney recently quoted as saying, "The scale and speed of these developments are not smooth transition. They're a rupture. They mean our economic strategy needs to change dramatically, and that your future will not be the same as my past." Against that backdrop, the committee's study here today is valuable work for Canada. We have been laggards in terms of productivity and growth and corporate R&D investment. Why is that? It's not that we lack subsidies. The government spends around $4 billion annually on the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Credit, or SR&ED, support that technology companies from across the country very much appreciate. The root of the problem is that Canadian companies look at their balance sheets and every day they decide it's not worth it for them to invest. The CEOs that I know are sharp and highly competitive individuals. If they're not spending on R&D, we should assume that they have their reasons. Moving the needle on R&D, business R&D, means making investments worthwhile for firms. To do this, the government has to create the conditions that enable firms to scale and reap the profits from the R&D. Fundamentally, that means that Canadian companies need to own and commercialize the ideas they generate through research and development activities. In short, Canadian companies need to own and defend their intellectual property, and the federal government has an important role to play in achieving that goal. Too much of our economic policy is rooted in outdated ideas about how value is created, ideas that don't reflect today's reality. In a globalized, intangible economy driven by software and technology services, productivity gains are derived from generating and owning valuable IP, such as patents, trade secrets, copyrights, and data. What's worse, so much of the economic value created from the $7 billion in annual existing federal R&D support is left undefended because we don't prioritize the intellectual property protection and strategy for owning Canada's intangible assets. This approach is out of step with today's economy, where 90% of the value of the S&P 500 companies comes from intangible assets. Owning IP also gives firms freedom to operate, the ability to grow and to compete without infringing on someone else's rights or paying steep licensing fees. Without ownership, there is no freedom to operate. And without that freedom, companies can't earn a return on innovation, so they don't invest. As the rate of return on intangible assets appears to only be accelerating over time, and markets are increasingly dominated by winner-take-most dynamics, or winner-take-all dynamics, Canadian firms need a savvy government that can lead with a clear IP and freedom to operate strategy. We have heard rhetoric from Prime Minister Mark Carney and his ministers that suggests that they understand the seriousness of this moment. And we are pleased with some of the reforms that we're hearing about for SR&ED in the upcoming budget. And the government's Buy Canadian directive is a watershed moment for federal procurement and long overdue. This is the kind of support through government purchasing which can be a huge accelerant for the growth of innovation and innovation companies in Canada. But the missing piece in all of this is still the intellectual property and other intangible assets. Sharp IP strategies should be effusive on its ability to look at innovation funding programs. It should be a facet of government procurement. Intellectual property should be a lens for every aspect of government economic policy in the 21st century, because these intangible assets are the lifeblood of the innovation economy. CCI has proposed that Canada should establish an innovation asset bank, a public institution with a mandate to generate, assert, and defend Canadian IP to catch up with countries where IP has been at the cornerstone of their economic strategy for decades.
Can you please wind up? Time is up.
Driving business, R&D, and innovation isn't about spending more money. It's about creating the conditions for investment. When companies can own and profit from the ideas they invest, when they can't, they don't. If we want to see more business R&D in Canada, we have to make it make sense for businesses to do so. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you to both the witnesses for their opening remarks. Now we will start with our first round of questioning with MP Baldinelli for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us this afternoon. Mr. Bergen, thank you for being here. In an interview you had with the Digital Journal this past June, you mentioned that Canada is struggling across core economic indicators, including declining GDP per capita and a shrinking number of global headquarters. In your opening statement, you mentioned the CCI was founded 10 years ago on the idea that Canadian prosperity must be driven by Canadian headquartered companies, an unapologetically Canadian economic policy as a cornerstone of our national sovereignty. So I want to ask you this question first, and we had talked earlier and mentioned some other things. So, I mean, would you say that the Brookfield headquarters move from Toronto to New York last year fit into what you are identifying as a problem that we face here in Canada?
Yeah, so I think that specific example I think is obviously housed in business dynamics for that firm. So I don't know if it fits into the exact rubric of what we're describing. Where I would say that we're really struggling as a country is what are the public policies that are required to help firms scale and grow. We're really good in this country at the what I call invention of R&D, but where we really lack is on the innovation side. And so when we're looking at public policies to advance the actual investments into R&D, we have to figure out why they're struggling to commercialize. I think the example you're giving, I don't know all the details specifically about it, but that's really more of the framing I would bring forward.
Well, to what was raised yesterday in the media, for example, Brookfield, which owns Westinghouse, along with Cameco, two, essentially former Canadian companies, doing a nuclear announcement in the United States. And here what we find is, OPG working on an SMR, but again, I mean, it's based on GE Hitachi Technologies. You had mentioned earlier, we're great at inventing, yet terrible at innovation. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So, where are there opportunities for us to help scale domestic firms here in Canada? And one of the big levers that we look at is obviously around things like procurement, right? So actually the government buying domestic solutions lead to the establishment of firms getting, created and add strength and opportunity. And they can then go out and get investments from those purchase orders. So when we look at how we're actually spending, let's say, our procurement dollars, are we actually procuring domestic solutions that are IP generated and owned? An example I'll just very quickly give you, which is pretty analogous to this, is the over-the-horizon system that we committed to purchasing from Australia. Roughly, $4 billion, $6 billion, somewhere where it all ends up. But it turns out that there's two firms here in Ottawa that have been funded to the tune of $30 million in R&D that weren't even brought into that process and actually solve that exact problem. And so here is a situation where we have Canadian government funding the R&D and support of a firm headquartered here, but then turning around with the other hand and then buying technology and solutions that end up supporting Australia or an Australian company.
Quickly, also in that Digital Journal interview, you link innovation to household prosperity, warning that Canada's economic position is slipping relative to peers. You were quoted as saying, you might not think if this impacts you, but it impacts you. You're getting poor because we're not figuring out how to do things more efficiently and more effectively. I mean, even today, the governor of the Bank of Canada warned that Canada must work to boost its productivity in the face of this weaker growth or face harsh economic consequences. Quote, unless we change some other things, our standard of living as a country, Canadians, is going to be lower than it otherwise would have been. You had pointed out to Canada's ongoing talent exodus, citing taxes, limited access to capital, and policy uncertainty like the Liberal capital gains tax proposals. Can you please elaborate on how some of the current policies are hurting Canadian innovation and pushing companies, entrepreneurs, and skilled workers elsewhere?
Yeah. So, one of the things I think is important in terms of some of the framing on this is that we have to understand that wealth and prosperity, as I mentioned, in my opening remarks, is now captured in the ownership of IP and data-rich companies. It's no longer captured in traditional forms of things like labor, where the overwhelming majority of it is now in who owns the ideas that are then able to be powering solutions. And so over the last 30 years, the economy has shifted, but our public policy hasn't matched. And there's no kind of silver bullets in this discourse. It is really about a system change where we think more fundamentally about how an innovation economy is fundamentally different than, let's say, a jobs economy. So let's take an example like the EV battery plant investments that were made, right? We warned the government that that is potentially a job strategy where you're supporting the building and R&D of foreign branch plants in southwestern Ontario, and that will create, some good jobs. And they would never want to besmirch that. But at the end of the day, where the actual value is being captured isn't in Canada. We're merely a part of the supply chain. We're not part of the value chain. And fundamentally, for us to get out of this, economic malaise or decline, we actually have to put ourselves at the center of the value chain and use the innovation and technology that's coming out of our fantastic academic institutions to the advantage of actually creating prosperity for Canadians.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Bergen. And now we will go to MP McKelvey for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Madame la Présidente, ma question est pour Monsieur Sirois.
Madam Chair, my question is for Mr. Sirois. In Quebec, there are many research institutes, such as the Quantic Institute from the University of Sherbrooke. What could we do more to assist Quebec universities in linking from moving from research to commercialization? Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. That is an excellent question. It is absolutely key to be able to address this issue that we're facing in Quebec. We've created a new society for transfer of knowledge, and we're developing a strategy to validate these new inventions with our Quebec universities and colleges. That is, we're looking at many technological transfers to companies. And we're looking at the spin-offs as well to really enhance the products of our research. For the time being, the efforts in the field are leading to successes. There's an increase of 15% per year, but we have to catch up to the North American average. First of all, we have to change the incentives for research professors who have to publish. We also have to use financial levers to foster research in order to move to the third aspect of this, to allow their discoveries, their research to be commercialized. This isn't sufficiently validated. And in fact, it's somewhat penalized. We have to develop incentives so that we can also obtain research grants that these researchers can obtain, because we have to put in place carrots, in fact, the incentives so that we can foster more collaboration with firms and to augment the number of transfers and technologies so that we can also patent the fruits of their resource when it is relevant. And it's very important that we remember that it's important not to neglect fundamental research. We need curiosity-driven research that is essential to foster prosperity in any nation. But on the industry side, there are mechanisms that need to be put in place that will structurally develop the incentives to enhance the valorization of the transfer.
Innovation credit. So I think, is that something new that you've implemented? And can you maybe outline how it works and what some of the early success has been?
C'est en effet au Québec un nouveau.
In Quebec, yes, that is an evolution that comes from the SHRED. That is an experimental research credit. First of all, it allows for a greater spectrum of expenditures that are admissible for development, for experiments, for validating tests, and these are all expenses tied to activities, but it is more at the forefront in the research and development. And it enables us to move closer to activities that make it possible to create products rather than simply to develop them and to then patent them and to export them. There's a certain level of depth in terms of expenditures for equipments that will now be eligible. So it really is a way of modulating eligible expenditures to enable us to focus more on stimulating commercialization expenditures. And it is new this year. We still have not have any demonstrations of it, but I think there has been this courage to deploy this effort because it's an innovative approach. It has not yet been experimented with elsewhere in other nations, and we're waiting to see the outcomes so that we can adjust as we go along. And the Minister of Finances is waiting for the results to see whether we can fine-tune the process. And like an innovative approach, we have to take a first step, see what works, adjust, and then stay the course.
Time. I have 1 minute.
15
Okay.
seconds.
So maybe I do have a question for the other speaker, but if you could maybe just send us in writing what that new innovation credit is and how it's working. Like, I would love to have more details on it, and as it does roll out, and you have those examples of early success, I think it would be great if you could share that with us.
Absolutely. It's going to be a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll squeeze in a quick question here. Mr. Bergen, I was just wondering if you could maybe provide some recommendations or ideas that you have on removing barriers that are present for businesses as they try to really scale up these commercializations that they have in their R&D departments.
Yeah, so I think, fundamentally one of the big ones is actually, tech transfer offices with universities. So similar to some of the items that Luc Savoy, has mentioned in the success of Axilis. And so, one of the areas where I would say we can really help SMEs in terms of being able to get the intellectual property and the freedom to operate that they require is looking at how our universities interact with domestic scaling technology firms. Currently, it's often quite difficult for smaller firms to be able to engage with the various offices that exist, and fundamentally, it's often large foreign multinationals that end up benefiting from the complexity and challenges.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up for MP McKelvey. And
Yes,
maybe if you
yeah,
can send a written reply. We will now proceed to Mr. Blanchet-Jonker for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je salue les témoins qui sont avec nous.
Madam Chair, I'd like to welcome our witnesses. My first question is for Mr. Savoy. Thank you very much for being with us today. Quebec is the only province in Canada where we have a chief innovation officer, which is you, and you work with the chief science officer who's been in his position for a number of years on developing the innovation strategy, the MSQ, for example, E2, that is a 5-year plan that is clear and measurable. So do you believe that this Quebec coherence doesn't already illustrate that we are acting as a sovereign scientific state? We're very aggressive when it comes to, first of all, thank you very much for your question.
Particulièrement.
We have a very sharp spirit to develop. We have a national research strategy that has developed. In fact, we now support innovation. We also provide support to technological and scientific entrepreneurship. We want to put in place a complete cycle of development. So it is a complex, complete cycle which provides support to creation, to growth. And we're also seeing an increase in startups and scale-ups in Quebec. We want to generate the wealth that at the end of the day can be used to be fed into fundamental research and so on and so forth. As well, we're focusing on companies, and we're trying to understand in detail the practices of companies and what hindrances they face, why they limit their targeted investments. And that is a new approach because thanks to the data we now have in hand, we understand better where to invest and how to assess the outcomes of various measures and programs. And it enables us to develop more fine-tuned measures. And you've mentioned this as well. You've spoken to the creation of the Chief Innovation Officer position. The idea is to show how important it is to focus on innovation development. How do we transform the product of research into concrete, tangible products that can be commercialized and create wealth? And we also want to invest in social development to implement this in society that enables us to address the major societal issues such as in homelessness and health, in housing and transportation. These are different types of innovation that we need. Again, that is also a focal point that is very unique. And in Quebec, we have a fundamental wish to have a positive impact on society as a whole. And I think that is something that all Canadians no doubt share. Thank you very much, Mr. Sarwa. The Quebec strategy for R&D and innovation, it's 2022, $27 a series, $5.7 million over 5 years. It is different investment levers such as Investment Quebec, the Fonds de Solidarité, the FTQ as well. And I'm looking at the report from the Innovation Council that you published in 2024. So in the meantime, in Ottawa, we're seeing that different resources are devoted to different programs. There is no measurable plan in place. Do you believe that what the federal government is doing is not undermining the overall performance of Quebec and Canadian innovation? Well, in our consultations as members of the council, we unanimously we believe in the current state of Quebec, and I think that could also apply to the rest of Canada. We need to double down on our strengths and on the sectors where we can be international players, both in the sectors as well as in the different firms. My colleague, who's also testifying here from the Council of Canadian Innovators, has spoken to the importance of supporting our technological and innovative champions who are able to create wealth disproportionately. This said, however, as part of the Chief Innovation Officer role, it is important that I continue to focus on support for exploration. In some areas, we really cannot target the most strategic sectors, and we're unable to define those sectors that will explode one day. And sometimes we're surprised to see what actually creates tomorrow's wealth. And I think we need to reserve resource capacity to explore this. And we need to further support other companies, especially in the regions where they can develop wealth that will be locally reinvested. Mr. Serrois, and Quebec has wonderful universities. We have research funds. We have the CC2. We also validate research, but the federal government only allocates 4% of the budgets of these research institutes. Don't you think that but by doing this, they're leaving behind the strongest link? Well, I'm speaking to you from the annual symposium, from the Collegial Centers for Technology Transfer. As the other witnesses have already indicated, this is a very important lever enabling us to assist companies. There is a challenge to me to integrate all of the different parts of the chain and to bring in more mechanisms to that resource, which ties me back to the previous question, which will allow us to transfer technology and knowledge and people to companies so that there can be greater performance. In Quebec, as well as for the rest of Canada, I think we have this opportunity of finding how the rest of the chain can grow. And there, of course, should be consequences on funding the last pieces of the chain. And this is more in applied research to make sure that all of the companies receive funding.
Now we will go to MP Ho for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My questions are for Mr. Bergen. We've seen declining GDP per capita in Canada for a while now. We're the fastest shrinking economy in the G7. We're seeing jobs and capital flee the country at a record level, and also a shrinking number of global headquarters choosing to make Canada their headquarters. Just as an example, recently we saw Brookfield, when the Prime Minister was chair, make the decision to move the headquarters from Toronto to New York. Do you see this trend continuing, and what does that sound the alarm for you?
Yeah, so how I would frame this is that, we're in a moment where we're seeing economic and real GDP per capita actually declining or become stagnant. And to kind of pull back to my earlier comments, we as Canadians have not understood that how wealth and prosperity is now captured is no longer in the tangible economy, it's in the intangible. And so when you look at the firms and businesses, that are currently globally headquartered firms, very few of them are IP and data rich. And so if we're going to begin to dig out from really the last 30 years, right, this should not be pinned on just a blue team or a red team or an orange team or a light blue team or any other specific team, but really look at what are the ways that we have to think about how we use innovation dollars to strengthen and create global champions. So, let's take, a firm in the healthcare space as an example, right? The amazing firm called IntelliJoint, based in Kitchener-Waterloo, world-cutting research in basically creating joints that can replace hip replacements, right? They can sell into, the United States and other countries, but struggle to sell into our own healthcare system. So here's a Canadian technology firm that was created at the University of Waterloo through R&D that was supported by taxpayers, and that we cannot get into our own healthcare system because of the way the procurement system is structured. And
Canadians getting poor as a result. I will ask a different question, kind of segue. Yeah. We're on the topic of the budget, and in the last budget in 2024, when the Liberals they flirted with the idea, they played around with hiking the capital gains tax, and then walked it back. What do you think are the effects of this uncertainty on policy and on taxes, on the business community, on research and innovation?
Yeah, so one of the challenges with something like cap gains is that, in Canada, accessing capital is a challenge. And so when you change that risk-reward dimension, your ability to, invest and attract capital becomes more difficult. And so what we really heard from scaling technology firms was the challenge when there is such a delta and difference between, a jurisdiction south of the border of us, that's a problem. And so that makes it more difficult. I think we're very pleased that we, eventually saw Prime Minister Mark Carney come out against it and ultimately say it would be reversed. As well as we were, eventually pleased with also seeing the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, come out against it as well, who, if you do remember when the budget was originally being tabled, that wasn't a known guarantee. And so I think making sure that we have, political parties, regardless of which side they're on, advocating for a growth and prosperity strategy that puts domestic firms at the center of it, I think is ultimately how we're going to get out of some of the economic challenges we find.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the Strategic Innovation Fund that the Liberals established a while back. Are you seeing that money, that which is funded by Canadian taxpayers, are you seeing that money go to Canadian enterprises, or are you seeing that maybe it's actually going to foreign-owned firms that are just happen to have a small presence here in Canada, a branch presence here?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And what I would say is that I think the Strategic Innovation Fund, in some instances, have been quite successful, but in others, there's been some real challenges, right? So 60% of every dollar from SIF has ultimately gone to a foreign multinational firm. So I think it's close to around $9 billion. 60% of that is going to, to foreign firms that are just, have offices here. Really good examples in the city of Vancouver. MasterCard received $40 million through a SIF application. Ultimately, what that ended up doing was making it a lot harder for fintechs in Vancouver to hire highly skilled workers because it drove up cost, and it also provided a subsidy to MasterCard in that space. And so, when we're looking at
a startup that isn't a multinational company like MasterCard, right?
Correct. Yeah. Right. And is it strategic for us to be giving $40 million to MasterCard, or should we actually be looking at how we support domestic players? So in that particular instance.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up for MP Ho, so we will now proceed to MP Rana for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all the witnesses for your time. Through you, Madam Chair, Mr. Suarez, in your interview with McGill in August 2023, you talked about decline in R&D investment to promote economic growth. So what specific policies changes do you believe that it should be the highest priority for reversing that decline in private sector?
I deposited to the committee our report of recommendations called Vers un Québec innovant, towards innovating Quebecs. And number one is the shift towards supporting and the providing the support to applied sciences, testing, more down the road type of activities in innovation and pre-commercialization and commercialization, reducing tax rates to on the benefits coming from the exploitation of IP and patents that were developed by Canadian companies and through these investments. There is a significant lack of know-how and personnel and ability and culture to deploy the proper practices and ways to manage innovation, manage R&D. So as surprisingly as it may sound, it is an area of training and skills development that could make a huge difference. I could go on like this. The incentives, as we've heard before from other people around the table, it's not more money that's going to make a difference. In this case, it's to make sure to provide more impactful incentives. And some of the most impactful ones are from on the public procurement side, but also on the procurement and use of Canadian technologies and products and services from large anchor companies.
Thank you very much. And Canada's innovation ecosystem is spread across provinces with variable resources and industry presence. From your work in Quebec, what would you recommend for national scale coordination to ensure regional innovation capacity is built and leveraged across Canada?
Good question.
That's a very interesting question. I think it's critical here to have both central coordination and decentralized execution. Nothing is more powerful than local orchestration and mobilization of the on-the-ground actors, the enterprises, and the proper decision makers. You need feet on the ground and to trust local leaders in stimulating and we've done that in Quebec with a regional innovation spaces and initiatives. It was mentioned the La Zone d'Innovation Quantique. We have 4 innovation zones. There's examples like that across the countries where local implementation is essential because it rallies driving forces and individuals and leaders that will make things happen with a global coordination. I would argue that you need a similar approach on the sectorial basis where sectorial leaders from the industry are better placed than anyone to figure out where and how to achieve results. We've done this in Quebec with the SRSR, les regroupements sectoriels de recherche et d'innovation, where together with groups of enterprises, they identify where to focus and provide investment. So it's a critical initiative to have this orchestration effort with dedicated data to see exactly where in region by region, locality by locality, what's going on in which sectors, where's productivity happening and where is it draining down? How do you compare across in enterprises within a same sector, sectors with among each others, sectors between the different regions? There's a whole architecture that I believe we can achieve in Canada that will drive result.
Thank you very much. And
time is up for you. We will now proceed to MP Blanchet-Jonca for 2.5 minutes.
Monsieur Serrois, le Québec a déjà tout pour réussir.
Mr. Roy, Quebec has everything. We have a chief innovation officer. We have an R&D and innovation strategy. We have the Council of Innovation in Quebec. We have Synchronex. We have 59 technology transfer centers. We have the Caisse de Dépôt. We have the Solidarity Fund. We have the Federation of the FDQ, the QFL, and the innovation centers, as you mentioned. But the federal government maintains many of the financial levers, all the while distributing its programs by imposing priorities that are often far away from our regional needs and strengths. I'd like to hear you speak to this. So this financial dependence and structural dependence that we have today, does that hinder Quebec and its planning capacities? And if, for example, all of this were entirely managed according to our strategies, would the spin-offs for our region or economies not be quicker and stronger? Well, it's clear that this brings us back to the need to focus on the areas where we are strong and where we can be successful. We need to focus our resources and target the financial resources also means that we focus on the actors on the ground. And in Quebec, there is the danger of having too many different programs. We have too many organizations who are all devoted to the same causes. So it's absolutely key to simplify so that we can enable companies to have a greater impact and to benefit from greater support. And to that end, this diversification of organizations and program is exacerbated due to our federal provincial system, which is not necessarily well coordinated. In Quebec, it's discouraging to realize that we did a detailed inventory of all of the innovation programs for funding and support. And there are some more than 200 different programs between the federal, provincial, municipal programs and other programs targeting specific players. For entrepreneurs, it's absolutely impossible to find their way through, and I think we need to do something about it.
And with that, now we will proceed to MPD Ryder for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming and speaking at our committee today. My questions are for you, Mr. Burgeon. Today, as MP for Kitchener Centre, Canada's innovation capital, something you said to me really stood out today. You talked about intelligent surgical, which comes from my home riding, being an innovative joint replacement technology, but they can't monetize. They're having trouble scaling because of red tape, bureaucracy. It's hard to scale here in Canada. Also, there was an article that came out today from CTV that said Warren Lovely, managing director with National Bank Financial, told BNM Bloomberg the private sector has already lost confidence in the federal government and this country is dependent on the U.S. Current policy in the past 10 years have not been in the form to create innovation and create technology in Canada, and we've lost investor confidence in this country. And this has been over the past 10 years. To me, this is a policy problem, it's a bureaucracy problem, and you even said it's not something to throw money at, it's how do we create investment. So to you, policy, what can we do to create investment here in Canada and support our innovation and technology sector?
Yeah. So this really is about an orientation. It's about how we think about how we support the innovation economy. And I'll break it down kind of as most simplistically as I can, and it sounds very simple. But at the end of the day, when we look at public policy, is it generating IP, right? Meaning, is the R&D that we're spending money on creating the intellectual property behind it in order for us to monetize it, right? And then the second question is the public policy that we're implementing helping to commercialize that IP that's being generated here in Canada? And then the third piece is, are we able to retain and keep that IP that we're generating here in the country? And so when you begin to orientate all of your public policy around that type of narrative, it begins to correct itself. So let's take an example like SHRED. It's roughly a $4 billion a year program. Turns out that about 50% of every SHRED dollar goes towards companies that claim to be Canadian in name only, meaning that we are subsidizing large foreign multinationals in a space where unemployment is effectively zero. At some point, that's just philanthropy. Huawei received $100 million in SHRED.
Huawei received $100 million in SHRED.
In 1 year, not too long ago, right? Meaning that we had already banned its technology from Canadians using.
This has got to be a negative net return on Canadian investment right now.
Yes, we call those negative spillover effects. So not only are we subsidizing foreign firms, but also we are depriving our own domestic technology companies of talent. Let's take in the city, Ericsson, right? They were given $79 million through SIF, right? That is money that's going to help to support a foreign firm that's hiring here in Ottawa in a sector where unemployment is effectively zero. What does that do to the labor market? It makes it more difficult for domestic firms to hire because of these types of subsidies. So when we think about the innovation economy, we've got to think about how are we orientating to support domestic firms so that they can scale, grow, and create wealth and prosperity. This is what all open small economies do. This is what they do in Denmark. This is what they do in South Korea. This is what they do in Japan. This is what they do in the United States as well.
And it's all around IP ownership. And so I also want to clarify something you said is that you warned the government that the EV current policy was just job supportive and not technology supportive in owning the intellectual property. So to me, that means that $31.4 billion that have gone to committed dollars to the EV, we're losing the jobs and we've lost the IP. Can you verify that?
So just to be clear, the position that we as an organization have taken is that by funding and supporting that type of economic development, it's not an innovation strategy. And so when the government at the time was saying, whether that be both provincially or federally, that it was an innovation strategy, we were really clear in saying that no, at the end of the day, who owns the IP that is creating those automobiles, whether it be through software and the technology or the actual EV batteries themselves? And the argument that we really put forward is that if Canada is going to actually benefit from the creation of these types of subsidies, how are we getting into the value chain? So is there ways for us to imbue our technology through public policy into those types of vehicles being made? And
so in short,
sorry for interrupting. MP De Ryder, time is up. And we will end this panel with MP Noor Mohammed for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for being here. It's always good to see you, my friend. One of the things I wanted just to ask you about is, you touched on this a little bit in terms of talking about SHRED and talking about SIF and all these other things. One of the things that, people often ask is, would we be operating differently in terms of how some of these larger potential companies, larger growth companies in Canada might be operating if the government were actually to invest and then take equity, make true investments rather than give out grants, having some opportunity for it, whether it's through an arm's length fund, have the ability to ensure that ownership stayed in Canada and IP stayed in Canada. How important do you think it would be for Canada to have such a fund, whether it's a sovereign wealth fund or sovereign innovation fund or something like that?
Yeah. So look, I think vehicles which help firms access capital is critical, and a lot of the critiques of the organization that I run is really around the fact that where are those dollars ultimately being allocated. So if you're creating a vehicle that is looking at how to redeploy existing dollars that we already spend in the innovation economy towards that type of mechanism, yeah, I think it definitely would be something that would be welcomed. Where if you're actually investing in these firms and supporting them, especially reallocating dollars that would be going to as I mentioned, things like MasterCard or things like Ericsson, there's a real opportunity there. So what I would say is, in the creation of that type of public policy, collaborate with industry to help make sure that it's actually aligning and finding its right placement. Because really, as I said at the very beginning of my comments, our organization was created really under the auspices of putting domestic firms at the center of public policy.
But just sorry for interrupting. We have a hand raised by Mr. Sarois. Any?
Madame
you
Chair,
wanted to
ajouter un élément de réponse.
If I may add an answer to that question. 2 points. First of all, the comfort level of Canadians and Quebecers with respect to the risk of investing.
Time, so it is like who he wants to ask a question. I just wanted to check, you raised your hand if there is any interpretation issue or anything else. So MP Noor Mohammed, please go ahead.
Merci, M. Sirois. Si vous voulez donner une réponse bref, bien sûr, allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Certainly, Mr. Sirois, if you'd like to give a brief answer, please go ahead. Well, we need to know whether or not Quebecers and Canadians are ready to live without risks of investment. Secondly, their original means of creating what you would like to create without using the capital in the nation's funds by, for example, guaranteeing the capital of Canadian investments and by providing incentives to Canadian investors to do this. Thank you.
Is obviously access to early stage capital, and the other is access to an ecosystem of mentorship and guidance, and of course, ensuring that those relationships between early stage companies in this country and folks who have managed to be successful is strong and is there. What do you think we need to see, not just from government, because government clearly can't solve every problem, but also from the private sector, particularly here I'm talking about larger innovators, particularly in tech, as well as PE and VC funds that are operating this country, to be more actively engaged in the ecosystem in a way that actually helps to strengthen the roots, establish the roots, and strengthen the roots of a stronger ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think the big piece I would say is that how do they relate, right? I often think of Timothy Snyder's quote, "Democracy is a verb, not a noun," and it's in that idea of how do you actually begin to bring different members of ecosystems together to actually communicate. So what I would say is that, for us at the council, engagement is sort of that first level. The fact that we bring, CEOs and leaders of tech companies to engage in public policy is a big way to help government understand some of those problems. So first thing I would say is, definitely kind of a showing up is definitely, a component of it. Some of the other things that we've also looked at, at the council is how do you create forums for our large, telcos and banks and other players to actually connect with scaling technology firms. Source Canada was an event that was hosted 2 weeks ago. We did sort of the underpinning of really supporting a lot of that work, where we actually need our domestic large firms to actually buy, solutions from these firms that are doing that type of R&D work and that are really trying to scale and grow.
So one of the observations I would make, just to your last point, is, as you know, Web Summit happened in Vancouver, and it was a big deal. One of the things that I observed was missing was the larger Canadian players being there. So you had larger foreign companies, you had small Canadian startups. But the Canadian players, the larger Canadian players, weren't there. So one of the things I think we should explore at some point, because I don't think we're going to have time today, is how do we ensure that those larger Canadian players are actually doing their part to be part of this ecosystem? Because we need them. We need them to do that. So I think that's probably my time.
Time is up, and with that, I want to thank both the witnesses for appearing before the committee. Thank you, Mr. Bergen. Thank you, Mr. Sarois. And if there is anything you want to bring it to committee's notice, you can always send your written submissions, and those will be circulated to the members. With that, I want to thank the witnesses. Mr. Baljanelli. MP Baldinelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just if I have the indulgence of my committee members, I'm just going to follow up again on my request of earlier, and I can propose a motion with regards to extending this study by 2 hearings. And the wording of such, and we will share that with everyone, is that in order to accommodate testimony from additional witnesses invited from all parties, the committee extend the current study on private sector investment and research and development in Canada by 2 meetings.
Okay, so it is being circulated in both official languages to all the members. MP Noor Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We would support the motion from the member opposite, obviously recognizing that we also want to make sure there's been our friend from the bloc has raised the point about ensuring that there is a good, healthy mix of where the studies come from. We recognize that, we respect that, and I look forward to whatever studies Mr. Blanchet-Jonca will bring forward so that we can also consider those hopefully favorably. My understanding is that the next study upcoming will be the study that Mr. Baldinelli intends to put to table. That certainly was something we would support. But I think in the context of this conversation, Madam Chair, we have so much good that has been coming out of this. We've had a remarkably low level of partisanship, but really high level of, I think, interesting conversation from everybody that we've been seeing on this. And it's a piece of work that will help the ecosystem. So I think by extending for a couple of meetings and ensuring that other witnesses that Mr. Blanchet-Jonca and others may want to bring forward have the opportunity to be heard, I think would be a really good idea.
Thank you. MP Baldinelli.
Thank my colleague for his comments, and in fact, on Monday I will propose the motion for the AI study. I know my colleague has amendments that he would like to make. I'm amenable to those proposed amendments, and so from that standpoint, we can then lock in the next study that will follow.
Thank you. And any further debate? Mr. Blanchet-Jonca?
Madame la Présidente, c'est possible de suspendre le...
Madam Chair, would it be possible to suspend the committee for 2 minutes, please?
For 2 minutes. Meeting is suspended. The floor is open for debate. MP Blanchet-Jonca.
Madame la Présidente, cette motion-là n'a pas été mise en...
Madam Chair, we did not receive the notice of motion. I will not consent to debating this motion. I understand that perhaps my colleague is tabling a notice of motion, but that has nothing to do with today's meeting, so I think that perhaps we should revisit this much later.
Blanchet-Jonca. Yes, the motion has been brought in, but it is related to the topic of the study we are in. So we can debate it based on the relevance to the study. The motion is in order, and we can debate and vote on that. Any further debate?
Madam Chair, call the vote.
Seeing no further debate, I will request the clerk to please take the vote on the motion brought by MP Baldinelli.
Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Oui.
Ms. Jasek,
Yes.
Ms. McKelvey,
Yes.
Mr. Rana,
Yes.
Mr. Baldinelli,
Yes.
Mr. Ritter,
Yes.
Mr. Ho,
Yes.
Mr. Mahal,
Yes.
Monsieur Blanchet-Jonca. 8 yeas, 1 nays.
Okay, the motion is adopted. So this study will be extended by 2 further meetings, and I will work with the clerk on the scheduling, and we will update you on Monday. Thank you. And is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Yes. Okay, the meeting is adjourned.